Hey, Daniel.
What's on the agenda today, Dan?
I think that's my question.
I thought I'd try it on for size today. But all right, three topics for today. First and foremost, how long to stay at a company and when you should decide to transition, what to consider when thinking about a career change, and how to assess a job's growth potential.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it. Well, first and foremost, Daniel, I just want to say that here at My Wealth Planners, we value our very talented employees and their contributions to the team and offer best in class everything. And I don't know why you'd want to ask such a question. I'm truly baffled. Uh, but okay, hit me. What exactly do we want to know about why you might want to move on from a job?
First, I could see why you'd think that. However, I do think it's important for a lot of other folks. I think we speak with people a lot who are at a job they don't seem like they love, and we meet with them quarter after quarter, and it's the same thing. It's not great, but it's good enough. And it's an interesting thing to hear because you can see they're clearly either not happy or undercompensated, or they don't like the culture or something else. And I guess it's an interesting thing to talk about is, how long should you stay at a company? And, maybe when should you look to transition? Are there red flags or things you should start to consider?
Yeah, so there's actually quite a few things that come into this. I think probably the most important thing is to go ahead and just frame this entire conversation with one particular premise. And let's just say we assume you like your job in your company. I think we're going to use that as our baseline because if at any point the thought of just like I hate my job, I hate who I work for, I don't like this, etc., comes into your mind, then all the rules of thumb and guidance we're about to talk about really doesn't matter, right? Life is too short to be miserable for 8 hours a day. So, in that context, let's just keep in mind we're going to talk about this in the idea that you're happy with your job, you like what you do, so on and so forth, but you're starting to feel a particular need or pull to consider something else, or you're wondering if you should be feeling that, if maybe you've been in the right place for just a little too long. So, with that framing in mind, I think the first thing to contemplate is typically speaking, career advancement, depending on the type of company, is going to vary quite a bit. And based on the type of profession, is going to vary quite a bit. Let's use doctors as an example. Most doctors are going to go to undergrad, go to medical school, do their residency, become an attending, and then from there they're essentially at the pinnacle of their career unless they become a super highly qualified specialist in something, or they work to patent a drug or a medical treatment or do research or something like that, or they shift from being just an employee doctor to being an owner. So when we think about that type of job, factors like compensation or happiness are going to come in a lot more than career progression per se, because in most instances for doctors in that type of world or in that type of role, there's no such thing as being sort of like a junior doctor and then like a doctor and then like a senior doctor and then like a senior doctor first class or something like that. It's not the corporate ladder in the way a lot of people think about it. And so in those particular cases, I think the biggest benchmarks are going to be your day-to-day quality of life elements. And again, the assumption, we're assuming you're happy, that you're not just miserable where you work, but just day-to-day quality of life, the quality of your office, your equipment, your support staff, and so on. And then just your compensation. Is your compensation market rate, number one? And number two, is it adequate to get you to a point where you're happy with your quality of life, your lifestyle, and the ability to accomplish the goals or objectives you have? I think that's the most simple example I could share in terms of how you think about when it might be time to move along, is not just like it's 3 years, it's 5 years, you've got to move. It's, are you well paid for what you do? And is your work environment conducive to having a good quality of life?
That makes a lot of sense. I think you see a lot of folks say, never stay at a job more than X years, and they give you a number. I don't know if that's the best way to approach it, especially if, like you said, you enjoy it, you're being compensated well, and it's fulfilling work. But especially early on in a career, and excluding the physician example, you're going to receive increasing responsibilities as you are promoted within a company. But how do you start to identify maybe when you've outgrown a current position and when it's time to maybe not transition companies, but either look for additional responsibility, or if the company isn't willing to give you that additional responsibility, start to seek it elsewhere?
So I think first and foremost, you have to be really introspectively honest and ask the question, am I excellent at what I do? Nobody is excellent at what they do on the first day. There's too much to learn. There's too many nuances, no matter what your job and career field is. Even you might say, like, I'm a ditch digger. How hard could it be? There's a big difference between somebody who's been digging ditches for 5 years and somebody who's been digging ditches for a week. So just to give that as your sort of example, I think the first thing is you have to be really good at what you do. There is a management principle. I want to say it's the Peter principle. I could be wrong about which one I'm referencing here, but it's essentially that people will often promote to their highest level of incompetence, meaning that we'll all essentially in our careers get one too many promotions, where at some point we'll reach a job that we're not good at, and then we'll sort of stall out at that position, but we already have that job, so then we become like that bad manager or that bad lead specialist or whatever it is. So the key thing here is, are you really good at what you do, first and foremost? And then I think the second thing that comes along is, have you expressed your desire for advancement, and have you articulated that to management and gotten a clear path ahead in writing? So this is a really common thing that I think is a mistake on a lot of people's part. They're sort of afraid to signal to management that they're not satisfied with where they are. They worry that if they tell them, hey, I'd like a promotion sometime in the next year, or I want to start learning more stuff, or whatever it is, that they're somehow telling management that they're going to leave or run away, or that they're trying to get a skill set so they can get a job somewhere else. But the problem is, management can't fix a problem for you if they don't know that you have that problem. Like, if you show up to work bright and chipper every day and do your work really well, you never complain, you never ask for anything, you're relying on the hope that they're going to recognize and acknowledge that and give you elevation or advancement, versus just saying, hey, I'm great at what I do. I'm great at what I do. I'm just interested in developing more skills or growing in some way, shape, or form. So I think the best thing you can do in that particular context is, if you already know you're excellent at what you do, it's to have a great one-to-one conversation or meeting with your manager, your supervisor, and to ask them point blank, if you don't already know, what do I need to do to get a higher title, a better position, to move up in the company? And there's a couple of answers you can be given there. One is a clear path. Hey, if you do X, Y, and Z, you will get a promotion. Great. Now go do X, Y, and Z if it's reasonable. Number two, you will get more of a squishy, well, just keep doing what you're doing and we'll figure it out. I don't love that one because, as I like to say, good contracts make for good relationships. I want advancement instructions in writing so that I can point to them clearly at some point and say, I did what you said I needed to do. Now it's your turn to do what you said you would do in this case. Or the third one is not really anybody's fault. Sometimes the answer is, I'm sorry, but there isn't an opportunity for that. And that may not have anything to do with you. It may be the fact that there just is no organizational structure or budget or revenue to support advancement for you, either individually or for somebody in your role or on your path. And that becomes a pretty clear signal that you do need to start looking somewhere else for that next opportunity.
I really liked the two things you said there. The first was how you phrased the, hey, what can I do to receive an increase in compensation or roles and responsibilities, as opposed to putting them on the defensive and saying, hey, I've been doing this and that for 3 years. Why haven't I been promoted, or what the case is? I think the way you phrase that is really great. And the second is writing, having things in writing. You do say that quite frequently, that good contracts make for good relationships. And I think when you have something more concrete, it holds both sides to that promise. And we see it all the time. Someone says, oh, yeah, come back to me in 6 months or a year. We'll rediscuss. And it puts the employee in a weird position where they never got anything in writing, so they feel awkward bringing it back up. And the employer knows exactly what they're doing and has no intention of potentially giving that person a raise. And that kind of leads me to a question I was thinking of here. So let's say the premise we started the conversation with is not true. you're starting to question leadership in the company, or you just see things that aren't in line with the way they were when you started with the company, and you don't love it. And how do you start to decipher between what's just you know difficulties a company deals with versus real red flags that you should be proactive about addressing and maybe looking for new opportunities elsewhere?
I think you have to look for what the impetus of the thing is and have to make a fair assessment of how likely that thing is to persist. So let's say, for example, two businesses merged, right? So it's awkward for everybody on both sides, right? This company's joining you, you're joining this company, however it works. They had their own, front desk person, their own marketing person, their own HR person, their own managers. Everybody's just going through a weird growing pain, right? We merged two different families. And in that type of context, you have to say, okay, that is going to be weird from the get go. There's no avoiding it. So, whatever weirdness we're dealing with right now, we have to accept that that's going to be how it probably is for the next 3 months, 6 months, a year, depending on the nature of the business and how quickly this transition is going. It's then assessing what it looks like 6 months down the road, 12 months down the road, and saying, okay, well, now we're past the transition point. Is this persisting, or have things changed? Is there a new normal? Because the new normal is what's likely to persist. Now, alternatively, you might say, in any given week or month, I'm really unhappy with things because management has decided we've got to do a full blown audit, take down, tear down of every system and make sure that we've picked every single corner clean and made sure everything's perfect. And so we're just putting in a lot of time. The work is really boring. And, I don't really like this. But you can see the light at the end of that tunnel. That project is not going to persist forever. So it becomes a question at the end of the day of, is it a time limited event, and do we just sort of need to just tough our way through it? Or is it going to be a persistent thing? Let me give you an example in our type of practice. Let's say we installed a policy where every time you want to talk to a client, you need to send me the email first. Every single time, no matter what you're saying. Okay. Now, if you're a brand new employee or team member, that might make sense for a little while because you go, okay, I'm brand new. I want to make sure I'm saying the right things and communicating in the right tone and so on and so forth. But there's going to come a time, 3 months in, 6 months in, 12 months in, where you're like, okay, I'm an adult. Please stop treating me like a child who needs to be sort of gated. So there's a balance there where you do just have to look at it and say, is this a persistent problem? And is it going to be part of the new normal going forward? Or is this a time limited thing? And I hate to say get over it, but I just need to get over it because it's just going to be a thing we struggle through for a little while.
Out of curiosity, if you start to notice things like that, do you think it's worth just documenting it personally and putting it in writing on your own end?
No. And to be clear, actually, no is not the wrong answer here. I'm going to say yes and. Here's the and. There's no point in writing it down for your own records. There's a great Carl Richards sketch where he says assets like the value of your homes, stocks, and list of grudges. And when you write down problems and just sort of keep them to yourself, you're just building a list of complaints. Well, the problem then is that what do you do with that list of complaints? Now, you might use it for self-reference to just sort of check yourself, 6 months from now and be like, was it always this bad? And then you go back to your list and say, oh, yes, it's been this bad for 6 months. I got it. But in practice, what's often going to happen with that is you're going to build up a list of these problems or issues. And then one day you're just going to dump on your manager or your supervisor. And they're going to be like, wow, I wish you'd said something, right? You're telling me about stuff 6, 9, 12 months ago. We could have done something about that, or at least we could have explained why it was that way or why it was going to stay that way, whatever it is. But now you're just bringing me this list of grievances. And I now am overwhelmed on the receiving end of that because you brought me those lists of grievances. Conversely, we have a rule here in our practice, right? I do not talk about somebody on the team and with somebody else. So I don't talk about Emily to you. I don't talk to Emily about you or anything like that without then going to you and talking to you about it as well. Because when we start to complain about or gripe about or whatever it is about somebody else's work or something in the work environment without ever talking to them about it, we're subconsciously establishing a set of expectations for them that we've never shared with them. Right. So if my complaint is, Daniel just drinks all the Diet Coke in the office, it drives me nuts, and I never tell you to stop drinking all the Diet Coke in the office, you're going to keep doing it, and I'm going to keep being annoyed about it. And then at some point, I'm going to snap and be like, stop drinking all the fucking Diet Coke. Okay. And then you're going to be like, wow, that was a big snap. I don't know why you were cursing at me now, Daniel. I didn't know that I wasn't supposed to do that. Versus saying, hey, You're welcome to take from the thing every once in a while, but we keep having to order Diet Coke, and the clients aren't drinking it. You're drinking all of it. So at some point, just bring your own Diet Coke. It's like that's an example. And by the way, you can drink all the Diet Coke you want. I don't care. But that's just an example where, as an employee looking at management or supervision, building up a list of grievances and never talking to them about it or communicating with them about it or proposing a fix or a solution or a tweak or something like that doesn't do anybody any favors, right? You're not communicating a challenge. They're not aware of the challenge, or they don't think the challenge is that big of a deal. And at some point, you're going to run into a problem where you've set an expectation for them. They failed to meet your invisible, unspoken expectation. And now you hold it against them, even though they have no idea what you're thinking about or talking about.
That's a really good example. I think it kind of reminds me of just, relationships as well. If you have a gripe with your significant other, the worst thing to do is hold that until you find a convenient moment to just blurt it out, and it comes out much more adversarial than it likely would have if you had communicated it effectively during that period of time. Side note, do we have an issue with my Diet Coke consumption?
Nope, absolutely not. You drink all the Diet Coke you want.
Sweet. Okay. So moving on a little bit, instead of transitioning firms or jobs, I want to talk about contemplating career changes. Some people don't love what they do, and it goes back to the premise from earlier. If you don't love what you do for 8 hours a day, that's how you spend a third of your life. So it's really not worth it long term. What are some of the first things people should think about when they are thinking about a career change?
So I think a really important factor in this question, and this is a tough one for some people to answer, is do I live to work or do I work to live? There's no right or wrong answer to this, but it's very important. We often get sort of the Instagram effect where we see other people living their super duper best supermodel yacht lives, and we think to ourselves, like, I'm a hardworking person, I deserve that. But unless you're born into it, which by the way you have no power over, sorry, you can't mulligan that one until you get born into the right family or the right place at the right time. Unless you're born into it, you are gonna have to probably do some degree of work for it. And some people get lucky, some people win the lottery, some people inherit money. Let's put all that stuff aside because you can't do anything about that. Okay. So, in the context of you living your life, assuming you're the average person raised in an average family or even a below average family, whatever the circumstances are, when you look at quality of life things, you have to make a determination because if you talk to people who are super successful, super wealthy, etc., a lot of them feel trapped by it. They don't know how to stop. And so when we think about career moves, a lot of times what starts that is I deserve more, or I deserve better thought, right? We see something that we want. We don't own a house. We want to own a house. We want to have kids or more kids, and we just don't see how that's possible. And those are very reasonable things to want out of life. But sometimes we see some, I'm just going to say douchebag on the internet driving a Lamborghini, and you're like, well, if this douchebag has a Lamborghini, why don't I have a Lamborghini? Be cognizant of that component where I started, which is do I work to live or do I live to work? Because if you work to live, super flashy, shiny stuff is probably not going to happen for you. Some people get lucky, but just generally speaking, to make enough money as an employee or to start a business really shifts the needle in the direction of I live to work, right? Or I live to create that sort of wealth for myself. And so that's one big career move. Conversely, if I just work to live, then career moves should be more about having an adequate level of income and benefits and compensation to provide you for a basic need. And in turn, then just focus your energy somewhere else, right? Does my career suit my lifestyle? I'll use myself as an example, and this will sort of dip back into your previous conversational topic. But when I was still at IBM before I was ever a financial planner, I was there for, I think, literally 3 years and a month. And it was essentially not until sort of the end of the second year, going into the third year, that I ever had a point of friction where I thought to myself, I'm going to need to make a change. And there were a couple impetuses for that. One, I was doing my MBA, I was getting my certifications in finance. So I wanted to use that skill. I'd gone to grad school while I was at IBM, and I wanted to flex those muscles and ideally get the compensation that went with it. And as I started to sort of poke at the corners of IBM, figured out that there really was no internal career move option. There was nowhere I could really take that or go with that. And so the sort of point of caution that I had for myself there was, okay, well, if there's nowhere to go internally, I'm going to have to look somewhere else. The other thing that sort of nudged me out the door a little bit was at one point I went from being on a long-term 3-year contract with IBM to being what they call an IBM regular, which is just a full-time W-2 employee who never has an expiration to their contract. And I made that transition in my second year. On like October 3rd, I had to fly to San Jose, and go sit in the class for 2 days learning how to set up my computer that I'd already had for 2 years because they just had this standardized process. That was fine. But because I went to San Jose on like October 2nd or 3rd, instead of going before October 1st, at the end of that year, when I got my first year full-time long-term employee review, said, hey, you're great. You're top marks across the board. You're not eligible for a bonus or raises because you came on after October. And bear in mind, I've been working there for 2 years, but just the transition from contractor to employee, they didn't count that. And that really rubbed me the wrong way because I sat there and went, oh, hold on, I've just done this huge project for you all year. I lived in Texas for 2 months as part of this project, which Texas is fine, but I don't want to live there. And in this project, this whole process, you're telling me I'm a top employee, but I'm not eligible for compensation increases or bonuses because of completely arbitrary benchmark in how you decide what people get cut off from that process or not. It's absurd. So there's little things that can drive you to have that. There's these little aha moments. I know you had an aha moment in your prior firm that you've talked about before, where you realized that wasn't going to be the place that you wanted to spend the rest of your career or your time. But I think the aha moment is there. And then when we think about what career changes we want to make, we have to be very intentional about it, because the question here is, am I just going to go to a different law firm because I'm already a lawyer? Or is the conversation here, I'm going to go back to law school to become a lawyer because I'm dissatisfied being a manager at Target? It's very different conversations about what a career change really represents for you.
Okay, so let's go to the other side of that conversation. Is you aren't in a career that fulfills you, so you want to make a change. And you don't know if you live to work or work to live. Maybe you do a little bit of both. How do you start to balance, your passions versus practicality when starting to consider that change? Should passion always be a driving factor the way we see in social media and whatnot?
I think a really good example for this actually is financial planners as career change. So if you're not aware, listening to this, the vast majority of financial planners practicing today did not go to college to be financial planners. They didn't study finance or financial planning. They didn't get their first job in a financial planning firm right out of school. The vast majority of people in this field are career changers. And my favorite textbook example of that, the most common demographic of career changers, are teachers. Okay, so people who are teaching K through 12. And there's just such a perfect example for your question here, because most people become teachers out of passion, right? Everybody famously knows teachers are underpaid, overworked, the whole 9 yards. And yet tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people go to school to be teachers every year and become teachers every year. They then go through this grind of being an educator. It's a hard job. It doesn't pay well, et cetera. And they ultimately, many of them do make a decision at some point that they want to do something else. And many people have over the years in that field decided to become financial planners. And the evolution of that is often that they're sort of the money guy or the money gal at their school. They're interested in it. They're reading blogs. They're reading books. They take a deep interest in that topic. And when they take that interest in the topic, what then becomes an outcome for them is they want to make a shift to being a financial planner. They say, I want to get into this career field. And the good news for them is when they make that shift, it's often very practical, because if they can make the jump into a fee-only financial planning firm with a career track and a salary and benefits and whatnot, they'll probably get paid about as much as they were being paid as a teacher to start, or even more potentially. And only if they go on the sales route, if they go work for one of the big wirehouses or big regional brokerages, will they end up in more of a sales job, and that's its own issue. But conversely, some people are career changers from fields like engineering or medicine or law, and they often run into a big challenge with practicality versus passion, which is they're often making, $90,000, $120,000, $150,000, right? Really good money in their particular field. And when they come to be a financial planner, they're sort of dismayed to find out that they can either get a salaried job as an entry-level person paying $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year, way less than they were making before, or there are no salaried jobs that they're competitive for, and all the jobs are sales jobs, and they sort of get stuck in this position where like, I really want to do this for a living, but I'm married, I've got kids, I've got bills to pay, and I just don't see how I can economically afford to make this transition. And so that is why I use that as a good example for your question about passion versus practicality here. I think passion is a great hint at kind of what does your heart want, because I show up to work every day loving this job. I never hate this job. I like working with clients, I like working with you and Emily, Olivia. I like the work we do. I do it 7 days a week. As you know, I work on the weekends regularly, not because I have to, but because I like doing it. That's really powerful to me. And I would not be happy doing most other things. For somebody else, they might want that for themselves, but practicality can get in the way. So having a supportive spouse, saving up a lot of runway to make up for the earnings differentiation, cutting back on your expenses, or being careful about kind of what your cost of living is before you make a transition to a lower paying occupation can be really powerful and important things when you try to balance that passion versus practicality element.
That's excellent. Thank you. So let's say you're making a career change, but you want to take a step back. Maybe you're still weighing practicality versus passion conversation and don't know what you want to do. So you're going to take a sabbatical or a prolonged break. Can we talk about that a little bit? Sabbaticals aren't something I'm entirely familiar with. I've heard about them and had some families come in and speak about them, but I don't know a ton about planning for them and their practicality.
Yeah, so some companies offer sabbaticals, like education's famous. That academics, every 5 or 10 years might be sent to just kind of go putter for 6 months or a year. Essentially, they just get a year off to do something. And the idea here is we're going to remove all your day to day responsibilities, and you're going to go do some research or explore a creative idea as an academic and come back with some cool research. But sabbaticals in most places either are shorter term breaks, a month, 2 months off that you get to take as a benefit, or the personally created sabbatical where you just quit your job one day and you take 6 months or a year or 2 years off, and then you go back to work somewhere else. In Depending on the type of sabbatical or break you're taking, the biggest elements there are just that you're not going to put yourself in a bad financial place with it. You need to have enough non retirement savings to make that financially viable for yourself. You shouldn't be borrowing from your 401k or your Roth or something to fund this, because now you're really robbing yourself of quite a bit of financial independence. But if you just decide you're going to live frugally for 10 years of your career, and you're going to take 10% of your savings and set it, or 10% of your income and set it aside every year, not in retirement but in some sort of sabbatical savings fund, then you will have the financial bandwidth to take 6 months or a year off. It does help to have given some thought as to how you're going to come back afterwards and what sort of rehiring looks like in your field, because some people's skills are very perishable, so that makes taking sabbaticals very difficult. Some people's skills are essentially evergreen, where they can take time off and then pick up a job immediately as soon as they want to come back. So that's a very important factor. But if you want to do it and take a break, I think it's a great idea. I know a lot of people, particularly who take breaks around having kids. Being a stay-at-home parent is not the same thing as a sabbatical. But even in career changes or job changes, where they take a job and they're not going to start for 2 months, and they just take 2 months off and really just take some time for themselves. I've never heard anybody who's done that say anything but good things about it. Because back to that equation earlier, some of us work to live, some of us live to work. And I think if you're in the former camp, you deserve to take some time for yourself if you've given yourself that permission in the form of savings or the right support within your family.
What type of careers typically are difficult to take a prolonged period of time off from?
So, any career in which you have a license can be a difficult one, where if your license expires, if you're not actively practicing or doing, that obviously just creates a deadline around your ability to come back to it. And then certain fields really rely on state of the art things, right? If you are an engineer and you're responsible for helping construct giant buildings, that is a constantly evolving state of the art, where you may not forget like the math of the process, but even a 1 or 2 year break might mean you're behind the curve on using the most modern techniques and tools. In a field like medicine, right, perishable skill for things like being a surgeon, you might say, well, I'll always be a surgeon, I'll always know, the heart's always where the heart is. But again, back to being state of the art, having the best outcomes for patients. If you take 2 or 3 years off and then try to come back straight back into being a surgeon, you're going to find that a lot of your muscle memory from a thing you used to do all the time probably has expired on you to some extent. So it really just becomes a question of your competency, because most of us could go back to whatever job we had before and sort of muddle our way through it. But I think a big component to that perishable skill set becomes how reliant are you on state of the art research and practices, and how much of a negative impact is there to you not being a top performer when you go back to work.
All right. So some of these careers where you have licenses, do you believe if you take a sabbatical that you should just be staying relevant on current trends and things while you're on this break?
I think that depends on how easy it is to refresh. Take something like being a software developer. There's always this new cutting edge stuff that comes out in the world of software. But if you're fluent in JavaScript and Java, or in any other coding language, that skill is probably not going to perish on you very rapidly. And if you need to get caught up, you're probably going to be able to get caught up pretty quickly. Whereas, again, back to something like a medical example, you might be able to do a procedure reasonably well, having taken a couple years out. But the problem is you're not going to be able to do practice surgeries while you're out, right? You are out. You're no longer in the medical system. You don't have access to the equipment and the resources. So in those particular cases, staying sharp on your skills while you're out may A, be difficult to do, but also B, may defeat the purpose, right? If you have to spend 10, 15, 20 hours a week staying current on stuff, then your sabbatical is not really a sabbatical. You're just taking sort of an education break.
That's great. Thank you. So we kind of already touched upon the last topic here, which was assessing a job's growth potential. But I did think of another question I wanted to ask, and it kind of ties back into the first topic, which is pretty correlated to a job's growth potential. But, you know, I also notice a trend that people older and later in their careers tend not to transition as much. Let's say, you have somebody that's a little older and we recognize that they're undervalued and underpaid for their position, but say they're 5 to 10 years out for retirement. How do you start to evaluate a situation like that where they are comfortable where they are and they'd rather stay in a comfortable position instead of facing new uncertainty with such a short timeline in their career left?
I mean, I think that's fine. I think you sort of described the answer in the question, right? If you have reached a point of your career where you say, I'll be done in the next 5 or 10 years, I'm happy where I am, then the question sort of becomes, why rock the boat? Why make it more difficult on yourself? Why complicate the situation when you could probably just go be just fine sticking to where you are? And that's not to say that you shouldn't, have one last hurrah or go explore something. We have a lot of clients who are happy where they are, but they kind of want to take a step back as they get closer to retirement, where they want to take, let's say, they want to go from being a software developer, a senior lead person with a 60-hour week, to being a teacher. They just want to go and teach, coding or programming in a community college or something like that. They're going to make a fifth as much money. They're going to have probably just the same amount of hours, but a very different work life. And they're like, yeah, that's fine. And that's something where they're working not so much for the financial necessity of it, so much as just to enjoy utilizing their skill set for a little while longer before they transition into being completely work optional. That's something where I think that's more helpful. But if you're behind on your retirement savings, if you're not sure about your funding or your future, or if you're part of that sandwich generation, right, the people who are not only stuck taking care of their parents, but also taking care of their college-bound kids at the same time, the practicality of, trying to pursue something new just may not be there.
That seems pretty logical to me. Well, that's all I got for this week, Dan.
Okay. Well, then, as always, the question of the week. Daniel, what have you learned in the last couple of weeks that you think is valuable for our audience to know?
It's been an interesting week because, for context, we hired a new wealth planning assistant this week, and it's been interesting for me to observe and watch how much time, energy, and effort goes into training and getting them up to speed. That was me 9 months ago. So I was on the opposite side of it, drinking through a fire hose and trying to remember even a tenth of what I'm being taught the day of. And it's interesting because we went through the interview process and sifted through a multitude of resumes and then conducted interviews and made a decision. And I didn't realize simply how much time goes into the entire process of bringing on somebody new. It's not just training day of, or, fixing little mistakes here and there. It's also on the front end, finding someone for the position and identifying what you want that position to look like, and then integrating them into your team. So it's been very interesting to observe that, I'd say.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing as the hiring party, because there's some companies that make sort of hiring and firing part of their business model. And if you're like a giant institution, if you're a Walmart, you're going to be hiring and firing somebody practically every day of the week and across the organization hundreds or thousands of times a week or a month. In a small practice, obviously the impact's a little bit bigger, but at the end of the day, there's sort of an interesting observation. Nobody hires somebody poorly or badly by intent. And also nobody does poorly in their job intentionally. And so the responsibility when you bring somebody into a firm is to try to equip them for success and give them all the tools they need to be successful. And in turn, it's incumbent on that new person to notice that they're going to have some growing pains in any new role, and that communication is essential in that process, not only to get the best result out of the employee, but also for the employee to get the best experience out of working at that firm. The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.